leaves are... Hi everyone, this is Kristen, and I chose to do my presentation on nicotine. I've always found cigarettes to be around us all the time, so I just wanted to know more about the substance. So pharmacologically, nicotine is a chemical found in plants from the nightshade family. Those are plants such as tobacco and eggplants and potatoes and tomatoes. And obviously the most potent form of nicotine is found in tobacco. So that's why the leaves are harvested and they're cured and dried and ground up and then added to different tobacco products. So nicotine as itself as a chemical is very addictive. It's a colorless toxic alkaloid made of carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And it is a very potent parasympathomimetic stimulant in that it acts as an agonist and antagonist, meaning that it either causes an action at these different nicotinic receptor sites or acts as a antagonist and it actually blocks. It's like a receptor ligand that blocks the biological responses. So it has two different actions on the brain. And the dosing really varies depending on the method of intake of nicotine. It can go on the next slide I have a chart, but it can go from 1 milligram of nicotine to 100. The different methods of administration are via inhalation, which is any of your like burning tobacco stuff of cigars, cigarettes, pipe tobacco, e-cigs, which is vape, but it's still inhaling in your lungs, hookah, and a nicotine inhaler for treatment. Orally, we are looking at chewing tobacco, nicotine gum, nicotine lozenges, which those last two are used for treatment as well. Transdermally, snuff, which goes in your nose, and the patches and the nasal spray is also something that is for treatment. So this little table here I found helpful just to kind of get a better understanding of the different amount of nicotine that's found in these different sources. And I did a little math at the bottom just because you see one whole cigarette is 10 to 30 milligrams of nicotine. So if you're smoking a whole pack, it varies from 200 to 600 milligrams. And then to compare that to the little the vial of e-juice, which is what goes in like an e-cigarette, 2 milliliters is about 40 milligrams at most, which is like equivalent to a pack. So they definitely have less nicotine in them. They are definitely controversial, and I'll get into that a little bit later in my presentation. So physiologically, the nicotine is absorbed through the skin or the mucosal lining of the nose, mouth, or lungs. And as it enters the body, it's distributed really quickly through the bloodstream, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier rapidly. So, and if you are smoking, it reaches the brain within 10 seconds. So that's the fastest method of nicotine administration. And slower rates of absorption into the bloodstream are through the mouth, the nose, and the skin. So like the transdermal patch, you're going to have a lot more nicotine content in there because it's a slower rate of absorption. But once it's in the body, it is metabolized very quickly. And because smoking is one of the most common ways to ingest nicotine, I'm going to focus more on that for the remainder of my presentation. And the amount of the nicotine that's absorbed is really dependent upon the tobacco, whether the smoke's inhaled, or if there's a filter or no filter on the cigarette. So the average dose of nicotine from one cigarette is 12 milligrams. However, what's actually absorbed into the body is on average 1.06 milligrams. So you can see that the body really doesn't absorb everything at all. And however, it is important to note that just because with the nicotine yield, just because a cigarette is less nicotine does not necessarily mean that person's going to get less nicotine into their bloodstream. More commonly, they have the same amount as someone who smokes really high dose of nicotine in a cigarette, just because they overcompensate and end up smoking even more, or like taking longer drags. So it doesn't really matter. It doesn't help. The metabolism of nicotine is really quick. Like I said, it is metabolized in the liver by an enzyme that oxidizes nicotine and turns it into a more safe chemical known as cotinine. And this process takes on average 2 hours. However, cotinine will stay in the system. Like, you'll get increased levels of cotinine if you are smoking, and cotinine lasts for about like 18 to 20 hours. So you can actually like analyze the blood for a while after to see if nicotine was previously present. And then I think it's interesting that menthol is a chemical that inhibits the metabolism of nicotine. Therefore, it increases the half-life, increasing the high of nicotine to be for a little bit longer in the body, which makes menthol cigarettes even more addictive. So some of the physiological signs that we'll see if you are smoking, is that it acts as a stimulant, a central nervous system stimulant, in that it stimulates the brain's nerve endings to produce endorphins and dopamine, which interrupts our pleasure circuit and motivation, which makes it really highly addictive. And it also makes the brain stimulates the brain to produce adrenaline, which speeds up our heart rate, our blood pressure, and our respiration. And it causes a sudden release of glucose, which can make us really hyperglycemic. And I think it's interesting to note that it is the second most used stimulant, with caffeine being the first, and the second most abused drug, with alcohol being the first. So as a stimulant, it's obviously very common and preferred by a lot of people, and there are also signs of nicotine being also a depressant, and it's really dependent upon the mood of the user and their environment that they're in. So why would someone want to use nicotine? It may sound counterintuitive, but I want to kind of address some of the benefits of using, because due to time, I'm not going to go into all the horrible consequences of smoking and nicotine, but as most of us know, cancer and a million other things, gum disease, everything, right? But why do some people use it? And so there are multiple studies that it boosts cognitive functions and abilities and enhances your alertness so people can stay awake longer. It decreases depressive feelings. This is due to feeling depressed because you're not using tobacco, and so then you smoke and you feel better. You also kind of same system for relaxation, because you feel irritable when you're not smoking, so then when you do smoke, you feel relaxed. So it's kind of counterintuitive as well. It decreases your appetite, so it can help with weight loss. And there are lots of interesting articles out there about the medical benefits of using using nicotine. And one of their arguments is that nicotine itself is not that toxic. It is actually everything else that's in tobacco. So like in cigarettes, there's 4,000 chemicals, 100 of them are poisons, and 63 of them are carcinogenic. So, but nicotine itself may not be the actual demon of all of those chemicals that are in there, because isolated by itself, it's been used to treat lots of different neurological disorders and Parkinson's, ADHD, Tourette's, and schizophrenia. So there definitely are medical benefits to nicotine. And as with most addictive drugs, there is a high tolerance rate. It increases very sharply. But what's interesting is because nicotine is metabolized so quickly, people can lose their tolerance a little bit overnight, and that kind of supports the the best cigarette is the one in the morning, which is what a lot of smokers will say. There are serious withdrawals, and it's one of the most highly addictive thing out there on the market that we can get. The psychological withdrawals include the sleeping your sleep can be really off, you're really irritable, craving cigarettes, anxious, an increased appetite because you're used to that fixation. And the pharmacological withdrawals are also very, very prominent, and they include, just that want to light up a cigarette, to hold a cigarette, to smell it, to be around people with having it, and that can be just as hard sometimes as the psychological withdrawals. Because both of these withdrawals are so hard, the treatments are often combined, and those are the most effective. So when we mix psychological or behavioral therapy, either if it's psychotherapy, aversion therapy, CBT, help groups, we mix that with some sort of pharmacological component where there's a nicotine replacement, such as gum, lozenges, patches, inhalers, or there's different meds also on the market. That tends to be the most successful because the cravings are just really, really intense. And there's a really interesting research article that I read about how if they're unexpected opportunities to smoke, people who are trying to abstain often will break their cessation period and actually go ahead and smoke. So the craving, the lure around the social environmental factors is really, really strong. So this is just a good quote from Mark Twain. Giving up smoking is the easiest thing in the world. I know because I've done it 1,000 times. And unfortunately, the actual recovery rate is less than 50% of those who set out to stop smoking and who actually do. And these are some of the sources that I used on this presentation. Thanks, guys.